Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Islamic Economics series. So today, we're going to tackle something really foundational in modern economic analysis. It has huge implications for how we think about policy and human behavior, especially as we're all working to build a solid framework for Islamic economics. We're talking about the Lucas critique.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll dive into the critique itself, the thing that really shook the entire field. Then we'll get into the deep philosophical questions it raises about cause and effect. After that, we'll look at the two major schools of thought that popped up in response. And throughout all of this, we'll be looking at it through the lens of what it all means for us as we try to develop authentic economic models from an Islamic perspective.
All right, let's kick things off with the Lucas critique. Now, this was a powerful argument back in the 1970s that just shattered the confidence economists had in their standard models. For us, this brings up a huge question right away. If the conventional tools are fundamentally broken, how can we possibly expect to use them to build something new and authentic?
This is the big, disruptive question that Robert Lucas basically forced the whole economics profession to deal with. Think about it. If a government is about to change a major policy, let's say a central bank completely changes its approach to inflation, can the models that we've built on past data actually tell us what's going to happen next? Lucas's answer was a clear, resounding no.
Okay, so at the heart of the critique is this idea of rational expectations. The conventional view says people are basically utility-maximizing individuals who get how the economic game works. So if the government changes the rules of that game, these rational people will change how they behave. And when they do that, it breaks the very statistical relationships our models were built on. But from an Islamic perspective, that's really just scratching the surface. Human behavior isn't just about self-interested optimizing. It's also shaped by our faith, our ethics, and our obligations to the community. So if our models don't even account for these deeper motivations, they're even more likely to fail.
So you see, this is really a two-pronged attack. First, Lucas argues that these models are basically useless for their main job, predicting what will happen when you introduce a new policy. But he goes even deeper. The second prong of the attack suggests that if these models can't account for how people's behavior is shaped by policy rules and their own worldview, then they aren't even giving us an accurate picture of the economy as it is right now. They're just missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
And that right there, that leads us into some really deep water. We're talking about the theoretical problems of causality and what economists call identification. This is where the critique really bears its philosophical teeth and forces us to ask how we can possibly model a complex, divinely ordered reality.
To really get to the core of this, we have to think about what a cause even is. The philosopher J.L. Mackie gave us this really powerful concept, the Inus condition. What it tells us is that a cause is rarely just one single thing. Instead, it's a critical piece, an insufficient but non-redundant part of a whole set of conditions that, when they all come together, are sufficient to make something happen. Think of it this way. Striking a match causes it to light, right? But only if there's oxygen in the air, only if the match is dry, only if there's no crazy wind blowing it out, you get the idea. The strike is just one part of a bigger picture.
And this slide, it just perfectly lays out the problem. On the left, you have the causal field. That's Mackie's term for the messy, tangled, complex web of reality, which from our perspective includes the totality of Allah's creation and decree. Then on the right, you have the causal ordering. That's the neat, simple, clean structure that we as flawed humans try to impose in our models. The Lucas critique is basically saying that conventional models fail because their simple causal ordering completely ignores crucial parts of the real causal field, things like policy rules and, human intentions.
So this brings us to the technical heart of the issue. In econometrics, when you fail to capture the true causal structure, it's called a failure of identification. The classic example you learn in school is trying to figure out supply and demand curves. If all you can see is a bunch of points where price and quantity meet, you can't actually tell which part is the supply function and which is the demand function. The Lucas critique is arguing that by leaving out the causal role of people's expectations about policy, our big macroeconomic models are in the exact same boat. They're unidentified. We can't figure out the true, deep structure just from the data we see.
So you have this absolutely devastating challenge that's shaking up the entire field. What happens next? Well, one major school of thought came forward, and their solution was to pretty much double down on theory, arguing that the only way to build stable, reliable models is to derive them from untouchable first principles.
This famous phrase from Chalin Koopmans, measurement without theory, it really captures the whole spirit of this approach, which is known as strong apriorism. It's a critique of just looking at data and hoping to find patterns, without a firm theoretical guide. The argument is that any empirical work is basically meaningless unless it's strictly guided by rules and restrictions that you get from a well-thought-out a priori economic theory, a theory you believe is true before you even glance at the data.
Now, this slide is super important because it draws a crucial distinction. On the left, you've got strong apriorism. This is what the new classical economists championed. For them, theory is absolute. You start with these fundamental, untestable principles, like all agents are rationally optimizing, and you build your model from there. If the data doesn't quite fit, well, the problem isn't your core theory. But on the right, you have weak apriorism, which suggests a more flexible, back-and-forth relationship. Theory still guides your work, but if you find some surprising results in the data, that can and should make you question and even change your original theory. It's more of a dialogue between your ideas and the evidence.
But what if there's another way to look at all of this? That brings us to an alternative strategy, one that completely reframes the whole purpose of econometrics. Instead of seeing it as a tool to measure a theory we already believe in, this view sees it as a tool for observation and for discovery, for just trying to understand the world as it actually is. And this slide gets right to the heart of this observational view. On the left, you see the data-generating process. That's the real deal, the true, incredibly complex, and ultimately unknowable reality of how the economy actually works. We can never see it directly. What we can see are the confluent relations over on the right. These are the statistical patterns and regularities we find in our data. They aren't the true structure itself, but they are the observable results of that hidden structure.
And that's where this telescope analogy really clicks. Our econometric models are not perfect copies of reality. Honestly, to think they are is a kind of arrogance. Instead, they're instruments, like a telescope, that we use to observe the consequences of that true underlying process. Right? An astronomer doesn't actually see gravity. They see the movement of the planets. In the same way, we don't see the data-generating process. We use our models to get a clearer view of the patterns that it creates.
So if econometrics is our telescope, how do we make sure it's in focus? The answer is through really rigorous statistical testing. Look, we can't know if our model is a perfect picture of reality, but we can check if it's truth-like. What that means is that any part of the data our model can't explain, the leftover bits, the error, has to be genuinely random noise. If there are still patterns hiding in that noise, it means our telescope is blurry. It means there's still some structure out there left to be discovered, and our model just isn't finished yet.
Now, this whole debates between the apriorist strategy and the observational one, it's not just some technical squabble between economists. It's actually rooted in a really deep philosophical disagreement about the very nature of reality. And that's a question that is absolutely central to a Tawhidic worldview.
And this philosophical divide is absolutely key. The strong a priorist view lines up with a philosophy called nominalism. This basically says that general ideas like causality don't really exist out there in the world. They're just labels, they're structures that we invent and impose with our theories. In contrast, the econometrics as observation approach is grounded in realism. This view holds that causal relationships are real structures that exist independently out there in the world, just waiting for us to find them. As people of faith, this aligns so much more closely with our belief that the universe was created with an inherent order and with discernible patterns, the Sunan Allah. Our job isn't to impose a structure on the world, but to humbly use our tools to try and discover the one that's already there.
Ultimately, for those of us working in Islamic economics, the Lucas critique forces us to answer this fundamental question. Is our goal just to take a pre-made Western theory and impose it on our data? Or is it to use our tools, as imperfect as they are, to try and discover the actual economic patterns and relationships that exist in our societies? This choice defines not just our methodology, but our entire idea of what authentic Islamic economic knowledge can even be. See you in the next one. Subscribe, like, and comment.